The snow had been falling since dawn, thick and soundless, blanketing the pines and turning the world into a hushed white cathedral where even fear seemed to whisper, and in that stillness a small fire flickered like a fragile promise, its light dancing on the weathered face of the cowboy who knelt beside it, a man shaped by long roads and longer silences, his coat heavy with frost and memory, his hands scarred by rope and regret, when he sensed movement at the edge of the trees. Not the swift menace he'd learned to expect, but something slower, steadier, carrying the weight of endurance rather than threat. And there she stood, an Apache woman wrapped in buckskin worn smooth by years of survival, her braids dark against the snow, her eyes calm yet guarded, with 3 children close at her side like planets drawn by gravity to a single sun, their breath puffing white in the cold, their small hands stiff and red. And when she spoke, her voice did not tremble, though the world around them froze. "Can we warm ourselves?" she asked, not begging, not demanding, but offering dignity in the form of a question. And the cowboy's first instinct rose sharp and fast, a lifetime of warnings echoing in his bones, stories told by firelight of raids and reprisals, of blood repaid with blood, of borders drawn by fear rather than understanding. And his hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip before he caught himself, seeing not enemies but children, seeing a mother who stood between the cold and their breaking bodies. And in that heartbeat of hesitation the past surged up. The winter he'd lost his own family to fever and frost, the night he'd held his daughter's hand until it went still, the way the fire had failed him then, and the way it burned now, stubborn and alive. And the woman waited unflinching, teaching her children with her stillness that patience was strength. And the cowboy realized this moment would pass into legend or shame depending on a choice no one else would ever see. And the fire crackled as if urging him to decide. And he looked from the flames to the children's eyes and felt the old rules crumble, because the land was vast enough for mercy, and he nodded once, slow and deliberate, shifting aside to make space, adding a log to the fire with hands that shook not from cold but from the weight of change, and as they stepped closer the warmth reached them like forgiveness. And though none of them knew it yet, this simple act would ripple outward, bending lives and histories in ways no rifle ever could. And if you're feeling the pull of this moment, the quiet power of a single choice, remember that stories like these only grow when shared. So stay with us, subscribe, and let this fire burn brighter together. The children hovered near the fire at first, cautious as deer at a riverbank, their eyes reflecting the flames, their trust earned inch by inch as warmth seeped into their bones. And the Apache woman thanked the cowboy with a nod that carried generations of restraint and pride. And as they settled into a fragile peace, the forest seemed to lean closer, listening because peace in that land was rare and easily broken, and the cowboy felt the weight of being watched not just by trees but by ghosts, by the men he'd ridden with, by the lines he'd drawn between us and them, lines that now felt childish and thin. And as the fire grew stronger, the woman spoke, telling him they were traveling to reach kin before the worst of winter sealed the passes, that hunger and loss followed them like wolves, that her husband had fallen seasons ago, not to a bullet, but to the slow cruelty of displacement. And the cowboy listened, truly listened, for perhaps the first time, realizing how little he knew of the people whose land he crossed. And he shared his own story in return, not as confession, but as recognition, of riding for pay, of choosing survival over softness, of believing hardness was the only armor worth wearing. And the children, now braver, edged closer, one of them offering him a small carved figure smoothed by love and time. And in that exchange, something ancient shifted. A trade older than money, kindness for kindness. And when the wind howled louder and shadows stretched long, danger arrived not as rumor but as riders, distant at first, then unmistakable, their silhouettes cutting across the snow, men who would see this gathering as a provocation, a problem to be solved with force. And the cowboy's muscles tensed, old instincts roaring back. But the woman did not flinch, instead stepping forward, placing herself between her children and the threat, and in that instant the cowboy understood courage anew, not the loud kind sung about in saloons, but the quiet kind that stands its ground without raising a fist. And when the riders approached, suspicion thick in the air, the cowboy spoke before they could, claiming responsibility, claiming fellowship, saying these were guests at his fire, and the riders hesitated, because in a world ruled by fear, certainty was a weapon. And the woman met their gaze without apology, her silence louder than any challenge. And after a tense standoff, the riders turned away, muttering but retreating, leaving behind a shaken stillness that slowly softened into relief. And the cowboy laughed then, a short disbelieving sound, realizing that something inside him had broken open, that the old stories no longer fit. And as the night deepened, they shared food, scarce but shared, and stories passed between them like sparks, lighting faces, dissolving myths, and the children slept at last, safe by the fire, and the cowboy watched them breathe, and knew this night would follow him forever. And if this chapter stirred something in you, if you feel the power of understanding rewriting destiny, don't let the story end here. Subscribe and walk with us into what comes next. Morning arrived pale and quiet, the storm spent, leaving a world scrubbed clean, and the fire smoldered low as the cowboy rose, stiff but changed, watching the Apache woman gather her children, preparing to move on, because survival allowed no long goodbyes, and he felt a surprising ache at the thought of parting, as if a door he'd never known existed was closing too soon, and he offered them supplies. Not charity, but partnership, explaining the safest paths, the rivers that lied beneath ice, the passes that would remain open longest, and she listened, weighing his words with the careful judgment of someone who'd learned to trust the land more than promises. And before they left, she spoke again, telling him that fires remember those who share them, that warmth given returns in ways unseen, and she placed her hand over his heart for a brief moment, a gesture that carried gratitude without debt. And as they walked away, their figures shrinking into the trees, the cowboy felt the world widen, as if the horizon had moved farther than he'd ever ridden. And in the days that followed, his choices reflected that widening, stepping between violence and vulnerability, telling different stories around different fires, stories not of fear but of a woman and 3 children who asked for warmth and changed a man's life. And those stories spread, softening hardened edges, reminding others that humanity could survive even where history tried to crush it. And years later, when the cowboy was old and the roads behind him outnumbered the ones ahead, he would still feel that night as clearly as heat on frozen hands, knowing that everything he became after was born in that single answered question. And as this story comes to rest with you, remember that every view, every subscription, every shared moment keeps these stories alive, keeps the fire burning for the next soul wandering in the cold. So if this journey moved you, subscribe to the channel and be part of a community where stories don't just entertain, they transform.